We're about to hear an original HFY sci-fi tale titled, "The Galaxy Rejected the Blind Alien Royal." Then a human changed everything HFY sci-fi. Find a quiet spot, put on your headphones, and let the stars fall silent. If you enjoy cinematic sci-fi narrations, consider subscribing for more. Now we begin. The storm began without wind. It began as a pressure in the bones, a low, ancient warning that rolled beneath the surface of a dying moon. Varney's Roman 9 had no right to weather, only dust and a thin iron taste leaking through its air. Yet in the hour when the sky turned the color of cooling ash, Sarai felt the storm moving through stone and metal like a memory deciding to live again. She stood barefoot on glassed sand and lifted her face to the silence where stars should have been, where a father's voice had once taught her the names of burning things. She saw none of it. She had never seen any of it. Her eyes were pale, opal-clouded, untouched by the light her people worshipped. The Zelari had called her a blasphemy, a fracture in an empire made of radiance. They had carved her name out of the palace walls and cast her into the lunar waste, expecting the dark to finish what pride could not. But the dark had adopted her. Below her feet, the ground hummed with the slow life of the moon, fault lines whispering, old mining cavities sighing out breath as cold as a tomb. The storm rose through the rock with the cadence of a vow. It carried with it the shape of incoming mass and heat, the bruise-toned wake of a shuttle-bleeding atmosphere, the quick heartbeats of beings moving with intent. Sarai turned her face toward the descent and waited the way the blind learn to wait, inside her ribs, inside her pulse, listening to the skeletal song of matter. The shuttle tore a wound in the silence and carven wind whistled through. It bathed her in heat and static, then settled, a kneeling metal beast deciding whether to bite. The hatch sighed open. Boots struck soil. A dozen men and women formed a crescent against her, wrapped in plated suits with dull, earnest surfaces, their exhale making white ghosts in the cold. One voice stepped forward, rough and steady, the way a hand becomes a ledge at the last moment of a fall. "Identify yourself." Sarai angled her head. The language was new but simple, born for tools first and poetry second. She spoke in a careful echo, trusting tone more than consonants. "Exile, nothing, wind, right," a second voice muttered, a feather of laughter hiding fear. "Another poet in the desert." The first voice drew closer, footfalls clearing a path in the dust. She felt his mass, the way it refused to lean away from danger, from responsibility. He stopped an arm's length away. "We're human," he said. "We can help if you'll come with us." "Humans," she repeated softly, tasting the grain of the word, "made of iron and night. Sometimes, a breath that was almost a smile. I'm Captain Rhys Morgan." Sarai's fingers brushed the wound pattern scorched by the shuttle's landing. She found where the sand had fused to glass and leaned down to touch her reflected heat with her palm. It was warm and temporary like all living things. "I will come." They escorted her aboard the shuttle like they would a blade, respectfully, wary of where it might point. The hatch sealed, cutting the moon's sound away. For a moment, Sarai's world became engine pulse and hull groan, voices braided with the hum. Then gravity tilted. The shuttle rose to the war-weary frigate that had launched it, an angular silhouette studded with patches like old bandages. Human craft wore their survival openly. This one had earned its name in scraped paint and welded scars, vigilant. Inside, the air tasted of oil and coffee and pressure-sealed hope. The corridors were narrow, the temperature honest. Everywhere the footsteps of a crew carried the rhythm of work done without complaint because no one else would do it for them. Sarai moved with soft steps, her hand skimming along bulkhead seams. She felt the ship's latticework, the ribcage of trusses and plates, and the faint static tremble of its heart. The vigilant was tired but proud. She had known such pride once, wrapped in robes and protocol. This version felt truer, like heat baked into stone by a patient sun. They gave her a small berth near the observation blister, where a wide pane looked out into Starfield. She could not see the view humans crossed half a lifetime to earn, but the glass sang under her fingertips with the thin, crystalline music of temperature and vacuum. From the blister's hollow she could hear the captain approach, a low brass weight in the skeletal song of the ship. He didn't try to speak first. He stood near her, breathing with the polite quiet of a man at a grave. His silence had shape. It was not the silence of someone without words, but someone who knew words were not always the right tool. At length he said, "You'll be safe here until we find where you belong." Sarai turned her face toward his broadcast of warmth, the way a flower follows the sun by counting lengthening shadows. "I belong nowhere that requires eyes." "Maybe," Morgan said, "or maybe you belong somewhere that requires different ones." In the glass, a ripple passed like the afterimage of a thought. Sarai felt it slide through her bones and into the deck. She tilted her head, listening to frequencies no empire had trained her to hear. Her lips parted. "You're being followed." Morgan didn't move, but the atmosphere around him sharpened. "By who?" "Not who," she said. "What?" The vigilance alarms cut in then, their tone tuned to thread a needle between panic and action. The bridge called down a vector map, mass signatures in a dispersal pattern like water poured onto a dark table. On the primary screen where she could not see, the tactical officer traced the dots with a pen that had long ago run out of ink and been refilled stubbornly. "Non-conforming drive bloom, sir. Clusters. No transponders. They match nothing I like." Morgan's voice grew edges. Battle stations. The vigilant had fought in forgotten corners for years. It remembered how. Guns woke like lions roused from patient hunger. Shield modules throbbed and interlinked, a faint ache in the teeth to those who'd lived on ships long enough to call them home. Sarai took a step forward and laid both palms against the curve of the observation blister. In the place where light met vacuum, she let her breath slow until the shape of the oncoming things came into relief, not to any eye but as an impression in the fabric of what was real. They were not Zelari. They were not human or machine or hunger made steel. They were absence configured into intention. In their wake, the background hum of the universe sounded thinner, as if someone had skimmed cream off the milk of existence and left a blue watery remainder. She had dreamt of such cold since childhood. The old priest tutors had warned princesses against it like wolves in stories. The empire called them nulls, though the name was a myth pinned to an equation. She had thought them an admonition only. But there are stories that become true by waiting. When the first cluster reached weapons range, the vigilant fired. Pachyderm rounds went hunting into the dark, shells designed to hit suns like bells. Some struck. The impact sounded wrong through the hull, no satisfying harmonic, only a swallow, as if the universe cleared its throat and continued. Lieutenant Hale swore quietly in a way that suggested prayer would be an insult. "They're eating kinetic bleed." "Shift to closing coil bursts," Morgan said. "Light them up out of sheer stubbornness." They did. The vigilant painted the dark with arcs of electromagnetism that would have given a planet a migraine. The null clusters shuddered, then flowed aside like a school avoiding a net. One peeled toward the observation blister, curious as a shark with a diver's light. Sarai felt its wake stroke the glass, and in that cold nearness she felt something else, the shape of herself recognized. "Captain," she said softly, "I know what they want. Tell me." "They want the song under your ship. They want the part of you that makes heat and history and noise. They will unthread it from you carefully, like a seam." Morgan joined her at the glass because he would not stand behind his people when he could stand with them. "How do we stop them?" Sarai listened to the way the null cluster thinned the substrata. It worked like a sculptor, nothing removed with chisel and hammer, all by patient subtraction. She placed her palm flat and sent a ripple back along the vector of removal. It was small, imperfect, like a blind woman placing a hand on a river and asking it to turn. The cluster hesitated, a fractal of intention reevaluated. "Not with weapons," she said, voice hollow with awe and a hunger she had never dared name. with a note that makes survival expensive. Morgan's gaze felt more than seen held on her. Can you play it? Only if your ship sings with me. He didn't ask her to explain. The human gift was not understanding everything before deciding to try. It was choosing to be the kind of creature that moved forward with incomplete maps. He touched his comm. Engineering, tie life support harmonics to main coil resonance. I know we never do that. We're going to do that. Route it to the observation blister. Make the math safe if you can. If you can't, choose risky and elegant. Came a voice heavy with familial argument. Risky and Elegant has her own coffee mug. The ship's song shifted. Every system left its separate throat and found a choir. The coils gathered breath. Hale counted down ranges and absolutes. Sarai bent her face to the glass and opened herself the way a wound opens and golden ichor answers gravity. She had spent a life pretending she could not call the dark. The dark had spent a life pretending it could not call her. When the coil resonance crested, the vigilant let it out, not as a weapon but as a declaration. We are here, and being here is a kind of stubborn physics you cannot amortize. The wave cut through the null cluster as a boundary defines a country. The cluster's intention, dilated like a pupil, suddenly struck with a different kind of night. Its appetite met an old law. It reconsidered hunger. It turned. Across the arc of space around the vigilant, clusters peeled away, not retreat, recalculation. Sarai swayed with the expenditure of something within her more vital than heat. Morgan's hand found her elbow and steadied it the way men steady each other when pride would rather fall. A breathless minute later, only emptiness remained, and the simple buzz of existence returned, humbling in its smallness. Hale let out air he'd been holding. What did we just do? Morgan didn't answer. He waited until silence stopped ringing, then spoke softly to the woman whose blind eyes looked filled with distant rain. You didn't just save my ship. You saved the quiet between notes. Sarai's mouth shaped a tired smile. You kept your choir in tune. I only asked for the key. He guided her to a bench that had forgotten its bolts generations ago and sat with her. Neither of them looked at the star field. She could not. He chose not to. Instead, they stared at the floor where the scuff marks of work became a map, footsteps to machine to footsteps again. Who exiled you? He asked, simple as asking where a wound begins. My people, Sarai said. The Zelari, they are made of light and aesthetic doctrine. I was born with eyes like silence. To them I was an error you cannot stack in a pattern. They threw away a queen, he said without ceremony, and if there was pity there, it wore steel. They threw away a flaw. The court found it easier to change the definition of daughter than the definition of perfection. She turned her face toward voices beyond the hatch, someone somewhere, laughing too long at a joke because relief had staged a coup against fear. My mother wanted to love me in public. They killed her for blasphemy. They sent me to a moon full of broken metals so there would be nothing left to remember. The dark remembered. Morgan didn't say sorry. He measured where she had put the weight and put some of his there too. The dark remembered, he repeated, as if making a note to report to the next person he met who thought they were the only witness left alive. He stood when the hatch hissed, and the medic appeared with stubborn affection and a tray full of warm things in cups. Try the tea, Morgan said. It tastes like engine room and mint. Sarai took the cup in both hands, feeling the ceramic speak of hands that had set it down too hard 36 times and always apologized. She drank. The taste fit its promise, the human genius for combining trouble and comfort. The heat pooled against the frost held deep by exile. She listened to the ship settle from fear into maintenance. That was when the second storm began. This one declared itself with words. The calm spectrum lit with a language she knew in her bones even if she could not see the characters that spelled it. Sharp vowels made for law, equal measures of warning and beauty, chimes struck to gather the faithful. The Zelari had found a rule to cite for everything. They cited one now, and their rule called for annihilation. Hale shook his head at the translation that bled across a secondary display. Imperial Edict 7. All vessels participating in the concealment or conveyance of a prescribed entity shall be subject to incandescent erasure. That's poetic. It's how they pray, Sarai said. Morgan folded his arms and let the edict finish its ceremonial threat. He waited through the recitation of titles until the vacuum could take a breath again. Then he said very softly, as if trying on a coat he suspected might be right for the weather, "They're coming." Sarai felt it before she heard it. A rise across the spectrum, not light but the hunger for it. Far off, star systems adjusted their posture to accommodate a convoy of opinion. How many? Enough to put on a show, Hale said, nose tilted like a feral thing scenting wind. And enough to write history even if nobody survives to read it. Morgan made a small noise in his throat that would have been a laugh if you turned the lights up. Then we'll make sure somebody survives to read it. They moved like men and women who had long ago shuffled their priorities until oxygen, loyalty, and stubbornness were indistinguishable. The ship came alive to a war she hadn't asked for but would not refuse. The crew stapled jokes to terror and did their jobs. Sarai stood and placed the empty teacup on the deck, where it made the tiny ringing note of a small, honest thing finding a place to rest. She followed Morgan to the bridge by listening to the ship's heart. The Vigilance Command deck was a compression of chairs, corners, and gauges. It was ugly the way scars are, interesting in the inventory of damage endured and damage dealt. Morgan stood at the center and became smaller in no way that mattered. The view screen was an unnecessary kindness in a room full of people who preferred hard data and hard edges, but it gave history a face. It now showed a distant spill of fireflies, each a servant of doctrine, all wearing the same true crowns. Sarai felt her throat become an old wound again. She had been told since infancy that light was destiny and darkness was error. Now the empire she had once called home came to burn a shape out of the universe because it did not match a pattern. "They are not here for you," she told Morgan in a voice barely hers. "They are here to erase the fact that I could be saved." His answer was not a comfort. It was agreement trimmed into a blade. "Good, that means they are already too late." Hale began to call ranges and times the way sailors chant depth. Other voices piled on top with intercept diagrams and power margins, a choir of competence trying not to look at a mountain. In the quiet between those braids of speech, Sarai reached for the place in herself where silence kept a hearth. She found it drained and cold. The null song had a cost, and she had paid without asking the market price. She did not have enough left to lift an empire off the floor. Morgan's hand closed on the back of her chair, a touch for steadiness rather than permission. "If you can't do it again, don't die trying." She turned her blind face toward him. "I will not let you burn so the empire can sleep well." He lowered his voice. "I won't let you be the excuse they need to turn us into a lesson. We choose what makes us human. We choose to try, but we also choose not to throw good lives into a furnace because it looks like courage." Sarai was very still. Human courage, she realized, was not shouting. It was the quiet reorganization of values in the face of the unamused. It was listening to fear and placing it on the shelf next to the wrench and the family photograph. "Then let me place one more thing in your hands and leave the rest." "What?" "The shape of their light." She moved her fingertips across the edge of the console until she found the small, unimportant screw that had a burr from someone's tool slipping 5 years ago when they were tired and trying not to swear. She loved that burr in that moment with the fierce devotion of a woman who had learned to pray to imperfections. They bind themselves to resonance law. Their shields, their engines, their sense of being blessed. If you ring them with the wrong note, they will retune themselves until they crack. Hale was listening while calculating. "You're saying their doctrine is a feedback loop. I am saying they never learned to tolerate an off-key child." Morgan let breath out through his nose, amusement that did not dilute purpose. He turned to the engineer's pit. Bray, I want coil impurities introduced deliberately into our emissions. Sloppy and sincere, we're going to play wrong. Bray's laughter was a kind of marriage vow. Captain, I've been waiting my whole life for a commanding officer to ask me for beautiful trash. Make it honest. If we're going to be offensive, it should come from the heart. They spread out the hymnstress array, those parts of the ship's voice that were usually tuned to exacting frequencies for intership handshake and identification. They turned them into something between a trumpet and a child banging on a pot with a spoon. The first note went out. It was ugly. It was human. It was the sound of an idea unafraid of not being loved. The Zelari advanced staggered. It is difficult to choreograph holiness when someone claps on the wrong beat. A few ships drifted out of phase, their light dimming, then flaring as compensators begged the math to be beautiful again. Gaps opened in the formation like an embroidered cloth running under an impatient fingernail. Hale's voice sharpened. There, and there. Morgan took the vigilant into the tier like a man who expected the world to give way if he asked nicely and kept asking. They fell between hostile arcs, wrong singing, and fired into the seam with rounds that thundered out a different gospel. Shields buckled. A golden ship that had danced at Sarai's first naming vanished in a flare that felt less like death and more like a concept changing its mind. Retaliation came fast. Their doctrine had answers. Lances of brilliance stabbed the vigilant's hull and seared truth into the plates. The ship groaned. The crew tightened their hands on straps and stations and kept doing their jobs with that focus the living acquire when they temporarily forgive the future for not being promised. Sarai swayed and set her palm flat again, not to pull darkness but to listen. She could not fight like she had, but she could sense the place where noise became a map. Left, she said, and Morgan shifted a fraction of a second before Hale's instruments caught up. Down 2 degrees now. They rode between laws like an argument that refused to resolve. The Zelari tried being perfect harder. That had always worked. It did not work now. Slowly, then with the panic of a dam deciding no, their formation fissured. In the sound of the fracture, Sarai heard something else. An old palace bell, 3 notes struck at dawn. It took her 1 heartbeat to name it, Royal Flagship. She felt its signature across the field like a house she had memorized blindfolded. Her cousin ruled from that ship now. His name was Sar. He had the posture of a man who could see himself reflected in a sword and mistake it for a lover. He had pushed her mother down stone stairs with a ceremony that made murder a liturgy. He had left Sarai among the iron moons because his faith required choreography without smudges. He would not run. He would not listen. He would kill until the world agreed with him again. "Captain," she said, "bring me to him." Morgan didn't look away from the battle long enough to ask why. He only weighed likelihood and cost. "You'll die. I will die anywhere. I prefer to do it where my name can be set down as more than a rule violation." He snorted softly. You ever notice how the most dangerous people don't need to shout to get their way? A beat. "Hail, plot me a course that makes the gods sick, then don't fly it. Let me fly it. Bray, I need everything that can be called thrust without breaking our spine. We're going to pay the flagship a visit." He didn't tell his crew what to do if he failed. They already knew. He didn't tell Sarai to be careful. Careful had left the room with childhood. The vigilant dove. Lances laced the space it had just occupied, a mist lacework of sunlight. Their ugly song grew uglier, coils singing into a cough that made the Zelari's faith itch. The royal flagship loomed, a cathedral with engines. Its shield was fat with certainty. It had never imagined dying. That protected it from many things. It did not protect it from humanity. Morgan took the ship into the shield as if ramming a doctrine might do it the courtesy of becoming architecture. The vigilance prow kissed radiance and burned. The coil singers howled. The shield sputtered. Hale gifted it a slug the weight of a car and the mood of a rhinoceros. The shield became a thin film of stubbornness and then an anecdote. They were inside. Grapples screamed out, teeth finding ornament. Airbridge seals clamped against alabaster hull. The hatch earized open into a corridor that smelled like perfume and ritual, the aromas of a culture that ate beauty for breakfast and called it nutrition. Morgan headed the boarding party because there is no poem for a captain who stays aboard when there is ugliness to be done by hand. Sarai went with them. The Marines flowed around her like wolves escorting a ghost. Their boots ate a sacred carpet that might have taken 2 artisans 20 winters to weave. Statues watched with the helpless gaze of art torn into war. They found resistance made of light and silk and long knives. The humans responded with compressed air and decisions. The fight was short and honest. The flagship learned what blood was. They reached the throne corridor after 10 turns where no one would build a corridor, and 3 places where a man with more confidence than an architect had chosen aesthetics over safety. The throne room was a planet disguised as a room, a curve of crystal open to space, a dais with the geometry of a sermon, guards wearing splendor like armor. At the top, Sar stood with a face that had never allowed itself to be mistaken for a mirror unless it could be admired. He saw Sarai and forgot to breathe for a second. The silence that followed was not holy. It was human discomfort trying not to mewl. "You," he said at last, as if naming might resurrect the wall that had kept her out. "You should have been a small death, Sarai, a practical funeral. Now look at you. A banner for ugliness." Sarai walked until she could feel the edge of the dais with the side of her foot. "Brother cousin," she said, because they had been raised half-siblings in privilege and half-strangers in truth. "I did not die where you asked. I learned the rest of the world existed." He laughed softly, the way cruelty rehearses in a practice room. "You bring animals to my light." Morgan did not rise to the insult because insults need a certain level to climb. "We brought your failure to your throne. That's what matters." "Surrender now," Sar said, generosity layered over hatred like frosting over bone. "I will make your ends graceful. The court adores good choreography." Sarai tilted her face as if scenting rain. She listened to the flagship's internal song. It was perfect. It had never connived with duct tape or begged a pump to last one more week. It had never stayed awake with a frightened crew telling jokes to the dark while counting spare fuses. She pitied it. "Sar," she said, "do you remember Mother's garden?" His face barely moved. Gardens were for servants and speeches. "She planted a tree," Sarai continued, "in the eastern court where the light only entered at late afternoon. Everyone said it would not thrive. They planted another in the western yard to show her how things should be done. The western tree bloomed every calendar day and dropped flowers like paper lies. The eastern tree struggled and clung and grew roots around the rocks until the storm came and the western trunk broke at a line groomed too neat. After, Mother brought me to the eastern place and let me put my ear to the ground. I listened to patient roots." She said, "The world marries what perseveres. Do you recall any of that, or did you make ceremony of forgetting?" A ripple of movement touched the guards, a shift in attention that was not loyalty and not quite doubt. In the row of helmets, a human marine suppressed a small grin like a man watching someone tie a noose out of silk. Sar's expression didn't change. His voice cracked, the way metal cracks long before a blade fails. She was weak. She wanted to believe that struggle had inherent value. It does not. Only beauty matters. Only ease proves divinity. Sarai nodded once, a bow not to him but to a memory that had asked for acknowledgement and received it. Then she did the human thing she had learned since rescue. She did something imperfect on purpose. She sang. It wasn't a note any Zelari ear would volunteer to hear again. It was the wrong key and the wrong shape. It was her voice messed with gravel taken from the soles of human boots and engine rumble that had soothed her to sleep against the bulkhead. It filled the throne room with a friction that turned grace to unpolished stone. The flagship's harmonics tried to accommodate the noise and failed, then tried harder and failed larger. Buffered feedback went looking for the nerve that told the ship it was a correct thing. When it could not locate correctness, it found heat. Panels flickered. Some guards wavered, their light-anchored armor losing luster. One fell to a knee and made the quiet decision to be an individual. Sar snarled, the sound a beautiful man makes when he discovers rage is an ugly democracy. "Kill them," he said, and his voice hit 2 notes at once because perfection had left the building. The fight was not a montage. It was people, any of whom could die, pushing through a room they would never forget. Humans moved with economical brutality, and art learned by not having the time to write poems about it. Zelari fought with arcs of burning light that could write a name on steel. Sarai moved under blows like a woman who listens to the joints in her enemy's stance and chooses to be elsewhere when joints close. She did not kill. She rediscovered the space between blade and burden that allowed a man to choose not to continue. Morgan climbed the dais, not because height was strategy, but because love is displayed. He faced Sar with a gun that had the frank face of a tool that has watched its owner bleed on a floor and kept working. Sar drew a weapon that had never tasted labor. Their eyes met in the middle where history has to stand. They did not speak because men who know what is at stake can save their lungs. Sar struck first. Morgan caught the blow on his forearm and felt things he needed break in a willing way. He hit back because someone had to tell the future that perfection had been asked to leave. Sar staggered. The flagship, taking on the wrong song like a lungful of water, screamed with a sound that was not made for hearing. Sarai felt the moment the ship's core demanded uncreation. She turned, hands lifting instinctively toward the ceiling, and beyond it the architecture of the ship's field, and beyond that the small bright lives on the Vigilant she had learned in days to love the way a starving person loves bread, and beyond that the emptiness that was not empty but pregnant and patient. She could not pull again. The null song had taken that from her until she could rest, but she could offer extension. She took the last of the harmony she had, the part of her that remembered the quiet under light, and stitched it into the Vigilant through the air bridge like a woman sewing a patch on a coat she is not ready to bury. "Now," she said, though there was no proper vector, no calculation, only a longing arranged into instruction. Morgan heard what she meant in a voice with too much pain to be metaphor. He turned, bleeding and bright-eyed with the clarity that comes when losing becomes a kind of permission, and spoke into the calm with the efficiency of a man who had spent a life turning complicated things into short sentences. "Bray, we're leaving. Tear us free like a scab." The Vigilant obeyed. The grapples shot loose. The bridge retracted with the suffering of metal catching on art. The ship coughed itself out of doctrine and fell backward into honest space. Behind them, the flagship's core went from perfect to a kind of prayer that lights only say once. The explosion was less a boom than a negation. Light folded into light, then tore. The fleet saw their king become a star, then a memory, then an equation with missing variables. In the aftermath, no one fired. Every ship in the battle, human and Zelari alike, looked at the hole and heard an old garden bell. Silence became a treaty for a single shared breath. Hale's voice trembled with equal parts awe and horror. "Captain, we killed an emperor." "No," Morgan said, tasting iron. He watched the failing light eat itself. "He decided to die for the wrong thing. We decided to live for the right one." Across the battlefield, some Zelari ships turned their bows away. Others held position like men who stay in a burning house because the door leads to weather. A message stuttered in across the spectrum, unsteady with grief and the sudden freefall you get when a hierarchy loses a step. It wasn't a declaration, it was a question shaped like a plea. What now? Sarai stood on the Vigilant's observation blister again and let her hand find the glass. The pain in her bones had become a metronome. She had done what she could, that is, she had broken and kept moving, which is what most doing turns into. She listened to the way the fleet's song had shifted. Perfection makes a beautiful noise until you hear tiredness. Tiredness makes a human noise. She leaned toward the tiredness. A small craft detached from the broad field like a thought leaving doctrine. It approached with its weapons offline and its lights dimmed, which was the Zelari way of making themselves smaller. A hail sounded on human channels, halting and armored with formality that could not hide the rawness behind it. The face that appeared on the secondary panel was older than her, softer, a man whose eyes had learned to weep in unpracticed ways. He wore a steward's collar, not a soldier's. He bowed, the deep kind no one makes unless they also bow to themselves at the same time. "Sarai," he said, voice like a library left open all night on accident. "Your Highness, if that title still belongs." "In war, titles go on the floor and people step on them," Morgan said dryly. The man flinched in agreement. "I am Aratek of the Second Chancery. I served your mother. I failed her. I tried to fail more quietly after, so my failure did not become a fashion. It seems failure will wear a better garment today." He swallowed. "We request parley. We have learned there is a difference between light and the story we tell about it." Morgan's brow ticked upward. He looked at Sarai because some decisions were not his, and those are the decisions a decent man asks for help making. She kept her palm on the glass because that was where the universe treated her like a confidant. "Let them come," she said. "Make the table low, make the chairs close together." They met in the Vigilance cargo bay, which had the honesty of a barn. Humans stood shoulder to shoulder with grease on their sleeves. Zelari entered like men walking into whether they had been told was fatal, and discovering it is merely inconvenient. Aratek walked to Sarai as if crossing a river with a current that might steal his name. He sank to one knee. He raised his head enough to let her hear his breath. "Do you forgive us?" Sarai felt the question thud into the old damage with the precision of a hammer finding a nail by grave instinct. Forgiveness is a nice word until you put your teeth in it. She thought of her mother's last breath. She thought of stone stairs. She thought of a moon where silence taught her patience and humans taught her tea. She thought of Sar's empire crumbling not because of an enemy but because mathematics has opinions. She shook her head once, and the ache that passed through the humans was not anger but recognition. "No," she said, "I cannot forgive what is not mine. The dead deserve to be asked first. I can do something else." Aratek's voice broke on a rock. "What?" "I can guarantee we will not kill you while you learn to be different." He closed his eyes. When he opened them, they were not brighter, but they were wetter. He bowed deeper, almost a collapse, almost a relief. "We will take mercy by another name." Morgan made an approving noise. "Good. Now we need a plan so the part of your fleet that still thinks doctrine tastes good doesn't come back with more knives." They built something that day, not a treaty. Those get signed and framed and ignored. They made a working relationship. It was ugly, which means it could survive being used. Human engineers taught Zelari stewards how to loosen their songs. Zelari techs showed humans how to align a coil with a finger flick that saved hours and 3 broken knuckles. They ate together. Someone on Hale's team invented a dish that merged mint petrol tea with a floral Zelari tonic and named it after a swear word. It became traditional immediately because traditions are just jokes that no one stops telling. Each hour they weren't dying, they invested in not dying the next one. It did not make them friends. It made them accountable witnesses. News moved through the galaxy the way a rumor learns to walk upright. Some empires called the humans profane and plotted liturgies that involved flensing. Others whispered the humans had made a queen out of an unwanted daughter and used imperfection to break a rule. The null clusters that had tasted human song retreated beyond charts to consider appetite. Pirates declared a week of feeling shy. Merchants invented new insurance forms. A distant republic with more votes than roads declared a holiday, whose name no one could agree on but whose ceremony involved tea, and hitting a piece of metal with a stick with love in it. Somewhere a boy tucked a story under his pillow and slept through a storm. For Sarai, aftermath took the shape of work. She learned the vigilance systems intimately, not because she wanted to be a ship but because she wanted to belong. Belonging is always more wrench than poem. She learned to count time in maintenance cycles. She sang with humans in the engine room where the acoustics hid mistakes. She held soldiers' hands while medics stitched their skin back to their names. She listened to the dark not as a weapon but as a friend who shares silence. Sometimes in sleep she fell into the null again and woke with her hands clenched and the taste of being unmade lingering like a toothache. Morgan would be at the door then, a mug of something catastrophic and hot in his hand. His presence not a cure, but a reason to let pain be an inhabitant instead of a landlord. On the 30th day after Sar decided to be plasma, a Zelari ship came without weapons and asked for a word that had not been used in the Empire for 800 years. The word was election. The vigilance crew watched the ship's request bumble through translation like a goat on a staircase. They watched Aratek climb the ladder to leadership not because he wanted it but because no one else wanted to stop bleeding enough to try. They watched Sarai listen when he offered her a crown. "No," she said, and the surprise in the bay was delicate and complete. Aratek looked up slowly as if the ceiling might have a hint. "No. If I become what you failed to guard," Sarai said gently, "you will not learn to guard anything that did not come in with holy robes. You will put me back on a dais and sing. I have had enough songs sung to the wrong object." She turned to the human captain whose steadiness had become the gravity of her days. "But I can take a different office." Morgan raised an eyebrow. He was in favor of practical nouns. "Which one?" "Envoy, translator. One who can place a hand on glass and tell you what the silence is getting ready to do." Her mouth tilted, weary and wry, and perhaps occasionally break a thing with a note if it insists on being too world-sized. Aratek bowed, and the bow this time had dignity in it not borrowed from ceremony but grown by effort like callus. "We accept our luck." From then, the vigilant became a courier of unlikeliness. It carried Sarai between worlds where the Zelari had long been resented and now were distrusted for new and old reasons. She learned the weight of eyes that memorized a blind woman because they did not understand why. She learned the sting of her own people's glances, some full of hope a religion had starved out of them, some full of hatred built like a cathedral. She kept moving. You keep moving until the world cannot ignore your footprints. On Cauldron's Forge, a manufacturing planet that roasted metal until it became obedience, they walked into a labor hall where men had pinned their hopes to a wall with nails too small to hold. A Zelari administrator watched her enter and tightened his jaw to keep a sermon from falling out uncontrolled. "You," he said, accusation disguised as respect. "You will make them forgive the price of being governed." Sarai ran her hand along the hall's iron beam until the beam told her with quiet heat about the hands that had carried it and the song they had hummed to keep time while they lifted. "No," she said, "I will make you pay your bill." Morgan barked a laugh he tried to fold into a cough. The workers stared as if someone had opened a window in a sealed room. The administrator sputtered until dignity reattached itself. "You threaten the Empire." "I threaten the habit of using large nouns to avoid small obligations," Sarai said. "A queen would invite you to lunch. An envoy will read you your ledger." On the 12th day of their errand, the null clusters came again, not to devour but to stand at the edge of charts like men gathering at a fence. Sarai felt them before instruments bothered. She went to the observation blister and placed both palms to glass. There was no power to pull. There was a conversation. She found the tone they had shared, a shared reluctance to call annihilation a plan, a mutual interest in continuance not because it was noble but because nothing happens if nothing remains. She sang again, not wrong this time, only simple, a child's hum meant to tell the dark where the bed was in the night. The clusters held. They drifted like thoughts changing subtext. Then they flowed away. Hale let out a string of syllables that would have gotten him slapped pretty on more refined worlds. Did you negotiate with the absence of being? No, Sarai said. I told it there would be stories later. If we lived, he said, moving past awe into the necessary joke. Especially if we lived, she said. In a mining belt whose rocks had names like old dogs, a pirate flotilla painted with rust and swagger decided that empires in reform make good meals. They dropped our silence with their teeth showing. The vigilant opened a channel and showed them a picture of what had happened to one emperor and a recipe for Bray's brand of fuse stew. The pirates laughed until they didn't. Then their leader, a woman whose face held the kind of scars you respect, considered Sarai's blind eyes and said, "What do you have that we cannot steal?" Sarai touched the glass between them. A way to end the day without wondering if you deserve to lie down. The pirate stared for a long time. Then she saluted with 2 fingers and turned away. We'll come back when we've decided we miss being unsettled. Not all were wooed by new shapes. On Venrax, a colony where Zelari governors had once polished law until it gleamed like torture, riots broke and separated like waves. The planetary shield went up in a shiver of tension. Sarai walked into the crowds with no guard. She walked by listening to the anger's rhythm. At the center where rage smolders into grief, she found a thin boy holding a rock like an orphaned emotion. He looked up and lifted the weapon because adults had taught him one way to mean it. Sarai reached out and closed her hand around his, gently, decisively. "Do you want to hit me?" she asked. His breath was a torn bag. "I want something to notice." "I notice." She guided the rock down. "Throw this at the person who tells you a lifetime of pain can be solved in an hour by choosing a stranger who doesn't look like your mother. Throw it at the next friend who says, 'We are good.' They are bad because it lets him sit down before the work is done. Throw it at me when I stand next to power and forget to make it bend." He swallowed a sob and handed her the rock like a man surrendering a crown. She kept it. She used it later to prop open a door in a government office. Days turned to months. The vigilant collected dents and stories and a galaxy's worth of almosts. Morgan aged into a handful of new lines and an ability to say no to things that pretended to be urgent. The crew rotated, some mustered out, some married, some died with their names spoken by friends who put their tools down first. Sarai never put the crown on. She put on gloves. She became notorious for having grease under her nails in diplomatic pictures. The holopress tried to invent a romance. Morgan rolled his eyes so hard his crew told him to stop before he injured himself. Sarai smiled and let the rumors do their harmless work. What mattered was never a picture. What mattered was the day when the remnants of the old empire decided to make a last sermon of force. They collected under a zealot general who had stroked doctrine until it purred and sharpened his faith against it, until he could shave illusions with it. He built a fleet out of despair and mathematics, and the sorts of men who prefer abstraction to people. He did not announce himself with edicts. He cut a slice of space out of the map and closed his hand. On the edge of that newly holy territory, the vigilant waited with a dozen Zelari free craft and a ragged coalition of ships with paint jobs that told the stories of marriages, mercies, and repairs done at night. Sarai stood on the blister with her hand flat. Morgan stood beside her because it had become a grammar in his bones. He did not ask if she was ready. She would never be. That was the point. "Once," she said, voice thin and rich only because it held so much failure like treasure, "my mother said a tree is strong where it has had to make decisions. Today we decide." "Then let's be wooden," he said, and the laugh they shared was the only clean thing in a dirty afternoon. The zealot advanced with his new god made of geometry. He used tuned fields that made space fold politely when addressed properly. He cut lanes and expected gratitude. He spoke light with the smug certainty of a man who had never had to fix a pump because he trusted it. He did not understand wrong notes. He did not understand that you cannot retune people by decree. He did not understand the way humans do not agree to stop being inconvenient. The fight that followed deserved a choir. It got a chorus of grunts, curses, and the occasional gasp when something enormous either failed or did not. Bray took coils past the place coils vow friendship and into the realm where they asked to be allowed to die gallantly. Hale flew trajectories childish enough to trick genius and genius enough to look childish. Zelari allies learned to cheat their own rules until cheating looked like a mannerism. Pirates came because life is boring without a good story. Merchants came because trade is best when war ends. Refugees came because you cannot be a bystander to someone telling you to stop existing. In the center of it, Sarai did not summon Null or break a god. She did something more difficult. She kept everyone from stopping. She stood at the blister and called changes as if conducting an orchestra that had never met to rehearse and had sworn vengeance on all-time signatures. She told a ship when to cut thrust by the weight of a captain's breath. She told a pilot when to squeeze a trigger by the tremor in their hand that meant they were aiming at the shape of a father, not an enemy. She told a zealot general a story about a garden and a tree. He ignored her. He fired the weapon he had been saving, something that made light remember another job. It struck the vigilant across the bow and ran down the hull like a verdict. The ship screamed and lost the power that kept air molecules feeling important. Men and women grabbed anything bolted and looked for each other with their mouths. Morgan looked at Sarai. "We're going to die," he said, and the relief in the words was the relief of someone who will never have to choose anything after this. "Later," she said, and her mouth was a wound. "Not now." She closed her eyes and went to the place the Null had used. It had healed some. There was still a door. She pushed it open, not to pull annihilation, but to invite absence to be less cruel. It listened. It is always easier to break a wall than to convince it to become a window, but she did not have energy for pride. She levered at the dark with prayer. Something she would not have admitted was a word she could say. It moved a fraction. It allowed the vigilant to keep enough of its air to finish a thought. Bray bellowed gratitude into the pipes because sometimes you must tell metal you love it. The coils rallied like drunk old soldiers at last call. Hale made the ship stagger beautifully between grasping fingers of a god costume. The zealot's fleet pressed its case. The coalition bled literature, then a small Zelari corvette, one with a paint job that told the story of a family selling jewelry to buy rivets, broke formation. It rolled until it was upside down, as if to see the fight better, and flung itself into the face of the zealot's flagship not as a weapon but as a rejection letter. It did not explode. It latched on like honesty. Over the coalition channel, a voice young and shaking in a way angles cannot comprehend said, "We vote no." In a civilization that does not do elections, that is sex and violence in one sentence. The zealot's fleet hesitated. Doubt entered like a draft. Sarai pushed. She reached not for destruction but for a shade of quiet that made shouting cost too much. Around the field, weapons kept firing. This is not a miracle story, but fewer of them hit with purpose. The flagship faltered. In that falter, Morgan saw the on-ramp to audacity and took it. He punched the vigilant forward with fuel borrowed from tomorrow and aimed for the wound logic had left. They hit. The impact clanged across plates and doctor bills and every unkind word ever birthed in a maintenance bay. The flagship's doctrine cracked. The zealot general discovered that inside certainty is a hole where doubt stores its seeds. He tried to fire and found his fingers needed a new argument. He tried to order and found his voice had already been used for the day. He tried to pray and found light busy elsewhere. He lost. It didn't happen grandly. his power folded with the homely look of a tent taken down in the rain. Around him, ships stopped needing to be so angry. The fight ended the way most fights do, when a few people who had been screaming stopped, and everyone else realized their throats hurt and followed. After, the field was littered with physics and grief. They counted the living by lots and the dead by names. Sarai walked the triage lines, hand on shoulders, her silence spending itself on the queries of the recently spared. Why me, why not them, what now? There are no answers to those, there are only hands. She gave them. Morgan sat on a crate and let a medic sew him into the future. He watched his crew move with that post-battle hush that is not reverence but a pact. When Sarai reached him, he didn't say anything sentimental. He handed her tea. It tasted like victory and coolant. They watched the Zelari free ships drift closer. Aratek's voice came over an open channel, unfussy. "Envoy, Captain, we propose something small." Morgan's mouth did its upward trick. "From you that's likely enormous." "A memorial," Aratek said, "joint, for the dead on all sides, not because they all chose the right thing, because they all stopped being able to choose. We will write on it in the alphabet of work." Sarai nodded, feeling the glass of the blister cool beneath her palm. "Make it in a place where light comes late in the day." "Why?" Aratek asked with genuine curiosity rather than the suspicion doctrine breeds. "Because the roots grow better," she said, and Morgan laughed until the stitch needle wagged angrily at him. They built the memorial on a rock that had no value but location. Humans and Zelari and pirates and merchants and refugees and a null cluster that never came too close all contributed. It was ugly. It was perfect. They carved names until their hands cramped. In the middle, where a queen might have stood, they set a chair low to the ground, made of welded ship ribs and a tree trunk that had clung to stone long enough to kiss a storm and not break. No one was required to speak. Everyone did anyway, in the language of how their backs straightened when they stood up from prayer. When it was done, Sarai stood alone beside it, listening to the galaxy breathe around her like a patient that had decided to survive the night. Morgan came and stood without words. Minutes turned into that pleasant shapelessness only earned by toil. At last, Sarai said, "I was told once that the galaxy rejects the broken." "It does," Morgan said, "until the broken learn to reject the galaxy back." She turned toward him. He was not handsome in any way that made statues. He was beautiful in all the ways ships learn to trust. "You changed everything." He shook his head. "You did that when you didn't die where they told you to. We only showed you how loud our wrong notes could be." She smiled. The smile had all the lines her life had drawn into it. "I will never see the stars, not the way you do, but I think I have learned to hear how they are held in place. That's all sight is," he said. "The ability to name the shape of what you can't touch." They stood while the light came late and the roots deepened. The monument waited to be visited and neglected and rediscovered. The vigilant waited for orders that looked like opportunities. The free ships waited for a story to turn into policy without being bent over a dais. The null waited for more songs. Empires waited on porches to see if neighbors would drop in. The galaxy did not become kind. It learned to be less cruel where observed. That was enough for a while. They left the rock and resumed the work of endurance, which is always more important than victory. They fixed leaks. They translated when anger tried to wear uniforms. They taught children games that made them yell and then breathe and then laugh. They broke small rules when those rules required cruelty and obeyed larger ones when those required humility. They blessed broken things by using them. Years later, there were people who would say it had all been inevitable, that the empire had needed to fracture to survive, that humanity had been destined to be the hammer and the bomb. Those people had not been there in the rooms that smelled like old coffee and fear. They had not heard a blind woman sing wrong at a god and win. They had not bled on plates while someone told a joke from a childhood too far away. They had not watched a zealot's certainty collapse and known it would grow back if not tended. Sarai reached the end of one long day and sat in engineering where the coils exhaled warmth like a sleeping animal. Morgan sat beside her because solitude shared is the only kind that heals. She placed her hand over her heart and felt it keep time. "I miss my mother," she said. "You always will," he said. "She would not know this world." "She would know you," he said. "That would be enough." Sarai listened to the dark. It hummed. It promised nothing and kept it. She smiled at the honesty and leaned her head back against the plate. In that quiet, a young apprentice passed and saw them, two people who had chosen repair over anthems and thought it might be worth trying that too. That is how cultures change, with small sightings. The ship slept and woke and slept again. The galaxy spun its patient, murderous, generous math. The memorial collected dust and fresh flowers. Children dragged their fingers along machined letters and learned to pronounce names with respect. Old men told lies that were more true than their accurate memories. Someone invented a new holiday that required putting grease on your face and singing. The null visited again and left behind a shape that made mathematicians cry happily. Pirates stopped by and took nothing because it felt better. Merchants complained profits had dropped because peace is boring. Politicians pretended to have planned all of it and were mercilessly mocked in a way that made them plan less. Priests stood at sunrise and sunset and said shorter prayers. Teachers placed wrenches on desks next to books and told students both were texts. On the anniversary of the fall of a throne that had never deserved to stand so long, the vigilant returned to the memorial rock. Sarai walked alone to the chair made of ribs and stubborn tree and sat. She placed the rock a boy had given her on the ground next to her foot, a small weight keeping paper from flying away. She laid her hand on the seat beside her for her mother, who arrived the way dead beloveds do, with a sensation that parts of your body are being remembered by someone else. She did not speak. She let the silence do it. It used the time well. When she finally rose, she did not bow to the monument. She bowed to the scuff marks left by boots. Then she returned to her ship. Morgan fell into step, neither ahead nor behind. He said nothing because words would have been a leak. On the bridge, Hale tossed her a rag without looking away from a panel and said, "You're dripping meaning on my deck." "Let it stain," she said. He grunted approval. Bray called from below, asking whose turn it was to bribe the coil with poetry. The comm crackled with a request from a small moon, whose governor needed to learn the word enough. The navigation plotted a route through unspectacular space where undescribed people would make small good decisions because someone had to carry that habit to the next town. The vigilant turned and went. Sarai stood at the blister one more time, because that is where she always ended her arguments with infinity. She laid her palm to the glass and listened to the dark hold the stars like a mother with hard hands. She whispered to the void, not as a spell, not as a demand, but as gratitude for something that had refused to be ended and had allowed compatriots instead. The galaxy had not become gentle. It had learned the cost of cruelty. It had met a blind royal and a captain who chose to endure over conquer. It had watched humans make music out of wrong notes until the floor steadied. It had seen a throne become a chair. It had counted graves and taught their names to children. It had decided to keep turning but with its neck cocked to listen. And that day the galaxy learned humanity doesn't conquer, it endures. Headphone, if you enjoyed this story, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to the channel for more epic HFY sci-fi tales. Until next time, stay human, stay unbroken.